Hello and welcome. You are watching News 9 Live. I am Krishna Kumar, and today at this hour we are discussing China's President Xi Jinping's Ukraine peace plan. Xi Jinping is in Moscow and he has been in talks with Russia's President Vladimir Putin and on what is being called the Chinese plan, quote unquote, to end the war in Ukraine. The Russian leader met the Chinese president to discuss the war in Ukraine, and the relationship between the two countries continue to be strong at this time of war. And China's plan, incidentally, was published last month. It does not explicitly call for Russia to leave Ukraine, but it gives 12 points and calls for peace talks, respect for national sovereignty as well. However, it's all seeming ambiguous without any specific proposals, really. Xi Jinping maintains that he is sticking to the United Nations Charter in the Ukrainian settlement and holds an unbiased position on the matter. Let's listen in to what Xi Jinping had to say.
我想强调，在乌克兰危机问题上，中方一贯遵循联合国宪章宗旨和原则，秉持客观公正立场，积极劝和促谈，按照事情本身的是非曲折，决定自身立场，始终坚定站在和平一边，站在对话一边，站在历史正确一边。
So for once, Russia is open to a peace process in Ukraine, and could the irony of ironies happen that China, of all countries, finds the solution to end the war in Ukraine? To understand that better, we're now being joined by Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni, defense expert on the show, and also Prasoon Sharma, geopolitical expert, joining us on the show as well. Thank you both of you gentlemen for taking time out to be with us. So I'm going to begin by asking the simple question to Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni. How much of faith do you have in China's peace plan, or Chinese plan, so to speak, finally materializing in terms of peace in real terms?
Thank you, Krishna. But at the very outset, well, with a huge big question mark. Not for any other reason. I see it as both sides. When I talk of both sides, I talk of the European Union and NATO and the Americans must have trust and faith in the person who wants to bring in peace. So the arbitrator must be a trusted person. Now, at this particular context, well, Zelensky has said something that he would be willing to talk. Well, she hasn't spoken as yet to Zelensky. She has left Moscow already. And their 12-point peace talks did talk of sovereignty, did talk of nuclear, did talk of respecting each other's this thing and ensuring reconstruction plans and all of that. But unless there is trust, because they seem to feel that China is standing with Russia and Russians are the ones against whom the Ukrainians are fighting, and the Ukrainians have a support of the NATO countries and of course obviously supported by America. In this context, who is interested in stopping the war? The interest of stopping the war should be from somebody, and the stopping of the war involves the very first red line not having crossed is the Russians must vacate the areas that have been occupied. Now, Russians are not going to vacate the areas they've occupied. They haven't gone into what they may call special military operations, invasion, war, whatever it may be. The Russians have gone in with a specific purpose to teach Ukrainians a lesson. And if that lesson, the Russians are not going to vacate. So the very aberration of the start seems very doubtful. Much that Xi Jinping might want to make a peace proposal, but well, neither the Americans trust Xi and the Russians will. Of course, right now it's more of a necessity and more of a marriage of convenience, as they say, and rightly so, not a marriage of affection, because the Russians and the Chinese themselves had always had problems earlier.
Right.
Yeah,
fair amount of convenience involved in that marriage of convenience. I understand that. But you were talking about Zelensky. Let's quickly listen to what Ukraine's President Zelensky had to say, and then we'll take this across to Prasoon Sharma.
Що стосується фундаментальних рішень, ми запропонували світу нашу формулу миру, і це стосується і другої частини вашого запитання щодо відносин з Китаєм. Китаю ми і публічно, і дипломатичними каналами передали нашу формулу миру і запрошення брати участь в цій формулі. Запрошуємо на діалог, очікуємо відповіді.
We are awaiting your answers. The word coming in from Zelensky. Prasun Sharma, Ukraine is the one who's always been open to a peace process, has been trying on all counts, and now you have China and Xi Jinping's visit, creating this opening in Russia. Or do you think it's even happening in a sense that do you think Putin will, take Xi Jinping's words in the right sense to go towards a peace process in Ukraine?
I think Russia did, stated multiple times that they are ready for discussion to stop this war. But it seems the second stakeholder, I would say, in this war is not ready. That is supported by US and NATO. So it's just a diplomatic positioning which Xi Jinping is doing. And this also gives message to European leaders, which are, China is expecting that EU leadership will visit China in a month or two. So I think this is, there is a multiple messaging from Chinese side. One to US that they will keep supporting Russia if US, indulge in Taiwan and other Chinese matters. Second to Europe, that China is open for business and discussions, and third to the domestic stakeholders in China that Xi Jinping is, turning towards a global leader. First, China played a role which they claim truce between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and now Xi Jinping is trying to solve a global problem that is war between Ukraine and Russia. So
right,
this is more of a position.
Right, it's a positioning to prove that point. That's the word coming from President Sharma. Hold on. Let's quickly listen to what you're talking about, the other stakeholder in the entire matter, the second stakeholder you are saying, which is the US and the NATO. Let's listen to what is the word coming in from both the US and the NATO.
I don't think you can reasonably look at China as impartial in any way. They haven't condemned this this invasion. They haven't stopped buying Russian oil and Russian energy. President Xi saw fit to fly all the way to Moscow, hasn't talked once to President Zelensky, hasn't visited Ukraine.
We haven't seen any proof that China is delivering lethal weapons to Russia. But we have seen some signs that this has been a request from Russia, and that this is an issue that is considered in Beijing or by the Chinese authorities. And therefore our message has been that China should not provide lethal aid to Russia. That will be to support an illegal war.
Right, Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni, the first fear was that China could be supplying arms to Russia. Clearly that fear seems to be unfounded so far, at least. No confirmed reports that China is supplying weapons to Russia, but NATO's Jens Stoltenberg, they're confirming that there is signs of a request from Russia to China for arms support. In that sense, is this purely only diplomatic positioning from Xi Jinping's end, or do you think there's more to it than that?
Krishna, look at it this way, that China depends on trade, huge trade with the European Union. It cannot afford to sort of annoy the European Union. It also depends on America for huge trade. It does not expect sanctions to be imposed on China, though there's a lot of restrictions coming on. So China will be very, 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 very careful not to go in for non-lethal, because lethal aid to Russia, because that would mean the virtual end. Now, look at the way everybody looking at it, that Chinese are supporting the Russians. Chinese are totally dependent on the Russian oil. China is dependent on energy reserves coming there from Russia to China. And that is why even the Saudi Arabia-China arbitration and trying to bring the two countries together was to ensure its own energy. so that at least the energy part is taken care of. So China, in its own self-interest, not knowing what would happen in future, is ensuring that the energy crisis do not develop in China, because the Iranians are not seeing eye to eye with the Americans. The Saudi Arabians are falling off the favor from America. Russians, in any case, now are in war with America. So in this context, the Chinese have ensured that, well, his enemy are my friends, and therefore they should all be kept together for the energy part. Now, having said that, today China seems to be a suspect because all of them seem to feel that the Chinese are not real good arbitrators and they cannot bring in peace for a very simple reason. They have not condemned Russia, number one, that they have at no point of time said that the Russians should vacate the Ukrainian territory if any form of peace talks have to be conducted. If there is nothing like that, what is it? Are we allowing the Russians to hold what they are, that is virtually 20% of the Ukrainian territory, and then the peace talks start? Then at ab initio itself, the peace talks can't go, because Russia, the Ukrainians want 1991 proposition, and that is Crimea to be vacated, the entire 4 regions, that is the Donbas region, plus Zaporizhia and Kherson to be vacated, which is not possible. The Russians wouldn't go in for this kind of an invasion if that was to ever happen. So that is not a question at all. And therefore, peace seems doubtful. The Chinese will continue, well, this is only messaging and looking at it world over, that, look, let's see who's in which camp and how the things move, because Taiwan is something which is still at the back burner for the Chinese, because they are looking at it very, very closely as to what steps will be taking. Russians are ensuring that their identity is ensured and that there is a credible crisis. We're looking at it from Europe, because Europe, after a year or so, will find the energy coming in their way in a very big manner, because all said and done, inflation, recession, all of it is now bothering European Union.
Right, that's as far as European Union is concerned. We also have views coming in from Japan as well. Let's listen to what Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida had to say.
ウクライナの美しい大地に平和が戻るまで、日本はウクライナと共に歩んでいきます。今般の訪問を契機に、ボルディミルとの連携をこれまで以上に強化していきたいと考えています。
That's Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida speaking after visiting Ukraine, one of the many leaders who have managed to make that trip to war-hit Ukraine. Prasun Sharma, clearly these are two ends of the spectrum. Japan, who's been the most vociferous in terms of their support to Ukraine, and there is China, which has been the rock behind Russia ever since the war began.
Yeah, I think in the diplomatic world, things are moving very fast. If Xi Jinping in Russia, then Japanese Prime Minister was in Delhi, and before that, Australian Prime Minister was also in Delhi. And one thing noticeable is that Germany has signed a trade agreement with Taiwan also. So things are moving very fast. And now, after domestic elections in China, the Xi Jinping government is trying to catch up with the global diplomatic things moving. And I think trade is the major focus, and also the geopolitical things are already discussed by Mr. Kulkarni. But I think China is eyeing to do a trade with Russia with its own currency, and also have enough oil reserves or energy reserves through Russia, Iran, and Saudi. So this is what Xi Jinping's agenda would be for this particular I would say visit. And now with the absence of Western companies and trade relations, there is a vacuum in Russian market also. Maybe this can also give Chinese company a chance to explore things in Russia. So I think that is another angle. And in terms of global platforms, there was a news that Mr. Putin may visit India for SCO in June. So maybe it was also placed diplomatically that anything Putin announce or do something for this war-related things, it shouldn't be all credit will be given to Indian side if he does things in a similar manner. So I think comparatively seeing the whole scenario, I think it's more like a positioning, consolidating the for Putin, it's like consolidating that he's not alone. There are countries and leaders who are supporting them. And for Xi Jinping, it's again to consolidate himself as a global leader in trying to solve global problems.
Right, but then we're slowly moving towards, in a sense, what has always been feared, which is the Cold War era of a bloc really forming, isn't it, Lieutenant General Kulkarni? Because you have Russia and China on one side. When China wants to go become the global statesman that it wants to be, Xi Jinping goes to Russia to do that, and you have Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida going to Ukraine to do that. So these are two North Pole and South Pole in the scheme of things with the war that is currently progressing.
Absolutely. What really is happening is Russia is looking at China, wanting to be more stable, more prosperous. Obviously, the Chinese are also looking at Russians to be strong, and so that they could be, after all, the nuclear arsenal is all in Russia. Technology was very much there in Russia. The Chinese and the Russians didn't see eye to eye earlier, but today, of course, they're together because China is a $13 trillion economy. Obviously, the Russians want help. There's a $190 billion trade between Russia and China. There's so much of sanctions on Russia, but nothing seems to affect Russia because there's enough that is, as a trading partner, the Chinese are able to supply to the Russians. In this context, despite the sanctions on Russia and despite what the Western world thought that Russia would collapse, it hasn't happened so. In fact, all of it, the problems are more now with the West than they are with Russia at this point of time. So, and in a post-Cold War, where it was America and the Soviet Union, today it is America and even Russia is playing a role, the Chinese are playing a role, there are even countries like India playing a role, maybe a pendulum role, but there is a role that India is also playing. So there's a lot that is happening the world over.
Right. At this stage, I want to ask both of you gentlemen, actually, there was lots of talk about how India could be playing the main role. If it was anybody who could convince Putin to end the war in Ukraine, it would be Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Prasoon Sharma, this was reported about in the US. Many people in the US thought that India could be a key player in providing peace in Ukraine.
I think yes, and India is doing on the ground things, maybe not in media or gaining the PR. If you see during the G20 foreign minister meetings, India did arrange a meeting between Russian foreign minister and US foreign ministers. And if you see the positioning also, like before going to Ukraine, Japanese PM was in India. So definitely there must have been a discussion between Indian leadership and Japanese Prime Minister about this visit also. So I think India is much better placed to play a role, and I think India is already leveraging that and trying to solve problems on the ground rather than on the media platforms.
Right. So, Lieutenant General Kulkarni, I'm going to bring this back to you. But before that, let's now quickly listen in to what Russia's President Vladimir Putin had to say.
China has become a leader in the import of Russian oil. While Russia is ready to increase uninterrupted oil supply for the needs of the Chinese economy, broad prospects for Russian-Chinese cooperation are also opening up in the gas sector. In 2022, Russia almost 1.5 times increased the supply of this fuel to China via the power of Siberia main pipeline, and Gazprom met the wishes of its Chinese colleagues and carried out additional deliveries in excess of contractual obligation, which of course speaks of our company as a responsible supplier and reliable partner.
Lieutenant Sanjay Kulkarni, I'm going to ask you, that he's just basically giving a laundry list of the kind of energetic ties, if I may, between Russia and China, and that's the crux of the matter, isn't it really?
100%. Yes, what you are referring to as energetic ties are based on energy only. There is no denying the fact that the Russians gain by supplying energy. The Chinese gain and ensure that their factories keep moving, because unless the oil and the gas come in, how are their factories going to be there? So they are, in any case, are the world's leading, largest manufacturing hub that the world has, and that the Chinese want to ensure that. And their supply lines which are flowing from China can't be suddenly substituted by anybody in the world, at least in the next 5 years or so. So there's a lot that the Chinese have to gain. There's a lot that the Chinese would want peace in the world. But notwithstanding, the Russians know the Chinese have to be dependent on their oil. The Chinese will be dependent on the nuclear technology that the Russians have. Indians also, to a large extent, we also are a great supporter because we are also buying huge oil from Russia. The Turkey, the Turks are buying. So you have the Turks, you have the Chinese, they have the Indians. So all of us combined together, ensuring that the Russian economy is ticking. It is not coming to a grinding halt despite the sanctions. The West is aware of it, but then there are certain checks and balances. The Americans are looking at how at some point of time the Russians must get decimated. The Russians is what the Americans are looking at it. The Russians need to be shown their place now, and then they will tackle the Chinese. Simultaneously, obviously, the Americans can't tackle the two of them. Yeah.
Right. President Sharma, I just want to bring this back to you and ask you, you were discussing essentially Xi Jinping's peace formula for Ukraine that is probably, finding an acceptance with Vladimir Putin. How, in terms of just peace in Ukraine, where are we at this stage? Because, there's very little clarity on how soon it can happen.
I think this visit, I don't think so there will be a direct, contribution for this war ending. But yes, it's a preparation of upcoming things like we will be hosting SCO in India. So normally with SCO, we also have RIC meetings, Russia, India, China. So maybe this meeting can, break the ice, and maybe Russia can play a role to bring India on board to have this Russia, India, China annual meetings. Second, in May, there is a G7 meeting again where maybe Xi Jinping will be traveling. So Xi Jinping also needs some kind of bonhomie with other leaders or countries where it can give some importance to Chinese agenda or negotiation powers. So I think this visit also gives some substance to Chinese side that they have access to Russia and they can influence Russia for this particular agenda of ending the war. But in terms of the two major stakeholders, I think Ukraine and the NATO countries, I don't think so. They rely on the negotiation efforts of China, although they are just, gauging the things. And it's more towards China strengthening its own agenda. So I think it's more like a preparation for China for the upcoming diplomatic, meetings and, negotiations.
Right, it's more of a setup, so to speak. Would you agree with that assessment, Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni?
I think so. What Mr. Praful is talking about is absolutely on the right line, because primarily, what is it that the Chinese are looking at it? Xi is in his third term, so he's almost like a lifelong president. What has he promised by 2049, the Chinese? He's promised them moon. He's promised them he will ensure that the Chinese are the center of the universe and that the Chinese do not look up to anybody and they see. So the promising of the moon has to come with economic rise, with 13 trillion tons that they have the GDP, and possible recession which might affect the world, which will affect them also. Possible shifting of the manufacturing centers from China, which may come to India, Vietnam, may go to Brazil or wherever they are likely, but will move out of China. So the Chinese are going to lose a lot of world market. So the supply chains that still originate from China, dependency on China over a period of time will go down. So the Chinese understand that. She understands that by 2049, what is promising might not just happen. So the internal crisis in China also, and the way the economy in China is based on infrastructure, housing, this, that, and everything, there also collapses are taking place. And therefore, the Chinese are on the back foot. So they cannot afford to annoy the world. They cannot afford to annoy the Americans. They cannot afford to annoy the Europeans. So there is a lot that is happening at this point of time. Despite what is between Japan and China, you recollect last time when we discussed $300 billion trade that takes place between Japan. You go to Japan, 100 yen shops are all full of Chinese goods. So that's the way it is. So there is dependency. Of course, this dependency ensures that the price, this is working like a deterrence also. So this dependency acts as a deterrent. At the same time, the Chinese will not be allowed to do the expansionist policies and do what they want to do. So there's a check and balance. She understands that there is enough that the world does not trust China. The world definitely does not trust his leadership. Definitely the Chinese are not to be trusted because they buy everybody. And Chinese themselves, and of course the countries around India have seen, whether it is Nepal, whether it is Sri Lanka, whether it is Pakistan, whether it is Myanmar, or even Bangladesh, they all have seen the consequences of Chinese hugging them, and that hug can result in their collapse. And so the world knows what is happening all over. She is aware that he is not to be trusted, but then she is promising his people the moon as center of universe. And under these circumstances, I think India has a great role to play. India has to grow economically. India has to have internal stability. India has to ensure militarily it has to be strong. That Atmanirbhar is not just to be spoken about. Atmanirbharta has to be ensured. The Ukrainian crisis is distinctly clear, and we are not going to get too long a time. It's just about 2 odd years we are going to get to ensure. So if you are economically strong, militarily strong, and your internal dynamics are perfectly fine, then diplomatically we can play a role which the world is looking at it. Because unless you have deep pockets, you can't play a role without deep pockets. So that is where the whole crux lies. And therefore, until and unless we are a market which is growing, and we are able to hold.
And talking about deep pockets, China does have some deep pockets, and that's really the crux of the matter. Is again because China is fancying itself as a peacenik in Ukraine for the kind of deep pockets it has, Prasoon, isn't it?
I think the Chinese economic health is also not so good as compared to previously, because there are a lot of things happening within China. But I think for India, it's a good opportunity to negotiate, especially with Russia, to take technology for the defense equipments, and we start making our own by technology transfers, and few things already happened on the ground, and the numbers tells that our defense export has been decreased by 11%. So this is a very remarkable achievement for India, but still we are the largest importer of defense equipment. So this is an opportunity for India to take technology from Russia as well as US, so that the Atmanirbhar vision or mission can be taken care. It's not just deep pocket, it's also strategic resources which defines the future.
The strategy that defines the future. Let me take in closing comments then from Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni. Lieutenant General Sanjay Kulkarni, Xi Jinping's peace plan is being discussed because it's been more than a year of war, and as you've been telling us, it's not going to be easy on the West, specifically speaking, because of the energy crisis that is hitting them because of all the oil and the energy they're not getting from Russia. So there is now pressure building definitely to find peace for the war in Ukraine. Whether India does it, whether China does it, doesn't really matter. At this stage, the question is, when will the war end?
Absolutely. I think that's the crux of the whole issue, is when will the war end? Because much that the energy crisis in Europe appear to have resolved, it isn't so. The Europeans are paying huge, at least 3 times more than what they would have been paying. And even there's a limit to which they can store energy. And under these circumstances, everybody, definitely Europe, which is like what Jaishankar always will be talking about, whatever it may be so, if Europe must be concerned with what's happening the world over. And in that context, I would put it that yes, to a large extent, in the comprehensive national power, if everybody is looking at it, we need to build a comprehensive national power. The European Union, their dependency on America, especially in terms of weapons is concerned, has to go down. But the American economy, which is 40% or only on weapons, which is working the world over, who is the beneficiary? Obviously, the Americans wanting Germans to spend more than what they're contributing of the GDP to military expenditure. They're wanting France to spend more, and they're wanting Italy to spend more. So everybody, Japanese have increased from 1% of the GDP to 2%. So the beneficiaries in this entire thing are who? But the Americans. The American market, the American military lobby is the one which is the great beneficiary of what is happening the world over. And in that context, I would look at it, much that the world wants it to end, but it is extremely
extremely difficult to end because Russians are not going to vacate what they have occupied. The Ukrainians, well, they are just acting as, well, I would say, at the behest of the Western world. And at this point of time, West America is supporting with all the military equipment. Americans spend $800 billion. They've just about given $80 billion to the Ukrainians. They can afford to take the war for another 1 year for that matter. The Russians are exporting oil, getting adequate money. So they are quite happy to sustain the way they are. Well, the losers in this context, if it goes this way, are of course the Chinese, because the supply line from China will certainly find themselves diverted to other countries.
All right, I'm afraid we've completely run out of time here on this discussion with that. Thank you so much, Lieutenant Sanjay Kulkarni and Prasoon Sharma, for joining us on this discussion here on News 9 Live. We wrap things up on this one. Keep it with News 9. This is Krishna Kumar signing off.